Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Community Connection. I'm Robert Day, CEO of Patrick Henry Family Services, and I'm here with my lovely and talented co-host, Claudia Fletcher.
Good morning, Robert J. Day.
Good morning.
Don't call me lovely.
Can I call you talented?
Yeah, probably.
Oh, okay.
And brilliant.
But not lovely.
No.
Oh, come on. You look lovely today. I like the purple on you.
Way to not do what I say. Okay.
You're in the mood today.
I'm not going to tell you who put me there.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Don't do that. Anyway, we're going to do something a little different today.
We are?
So explain what we're doing, what you guys talked me into doing.
So I'm going to interview you.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you some questions about your childhood and about your current status. And that's going to lead us to some interesting things, I think. There's a lot of people who have heard your story, read your story, but there's also a lot of people who haven't. So it's time to bring some of that up, and maybe they'll understand a little bit more about your passion and why you're here and why we're doing what we're doing. So that's the plan.
Well, thank you.
You ready?
I don't know. Here we go.
So I've heard it said recently that you want to change your title, and that instead of being the chief executive officer, you want to be the chief executive orphan. But everybody knows that an orphan's parents were dead when they were a child, and that's not true of you. So why could you walk around saying you're an orphan? Tell us about that.
Well, no, that's a good question, because I firmly believe that one of the things we're missing in our society, and the reason we're not able to fix it, is because we can't identify it. We've lost the name for it, and that's the name orphan. And everybody kind of thinks of orphan the way you just mentioned it, a child with both parents dead. But I believe that the broader and biblical definition and a more practical working definition for us is a child who's lost one or both parents. I think that's key because fatherlessness and orphan are kind of interchangeable in the Bible. And so just having that one parent absent identified this as a vulnerable child, right? But if you also talk about disappearance or maybe a parent who is incarcerated or who's just disappeared, who's not in the child's life. They're alive, but not, functioning in that capacity. And so I think, America is surrounded by orphans, but they're invisible to us because we're not seeing them through the lens of this biblical definition of orphan. And so what happens is that these children grow up with an orphan spirit and even go throughout adulthood with this orphan spirit, but nobody's ever identified that, right? This wound. I heard you describe it once as the eternal wound.
Primal wound.
Excuse me. Yes, primal
wound.
Primal wound. So it's this idea. Children were meant to, be born in the context of a family, right? Of a mother and a father, and there's something about the bonding of that and an automatic support system. So what happens if one of them or both of them are gone, or they're present but they can't function because of drug use or mental health issues, or one of them's homeless for whatever reason. So children bear that, and if it's not identified, they carry that on into adulthood, and I call that the orphan spirit. And so I often call myself a recovering orphan. Okay. Because now I'm an adult, I'm not a child anymore, but I'm still recovering from some of the orphan injuries. And in fact, my mother was in foster care when I was born and gave me up for adoption. So her very first decision about me was to abandon me, to reject me. That all didn't happen, and I ended up with her. But the bonding never did happen. In her mind and her spirit, she had rejected me, but she still had to raise me and take care of me. But a lot of times I didn't live with her. I was somewhere else. So while my mother was alive, I was orphaned from my mother, and I'd never met my father until I was 10. I saw him again when I was 16, and then last time I saw him I was 41. So he was never really a part of the picture. So I was fatherless, even though he was alive. And I was motherless, even though she was alive. And so understanding that I was an orphan, I wish I'd understood this earlier, and that others understood this earlier. There's trauma that comes with that. It's not just trauma from abuse or neglect or some violence, although obviously some of that happened too. I was an orphan from a lack of love, affection, attention, bonding, kind of the normal things that, or quote, should be normal things for kids growing up. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. And so we've been walking together for almost 7 years,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Since that day when you were creeping on me on LinkedIn.
Yes.
And drug me to Virginia.
I drug you to Virginia?
Pretty much, you and God. But so I know some of the answers to some of these questions because we've talked a lot about this stuff. But I do want to go back and do a little CliffsNote version of your childhood. But before we do that, what are some things today that you would say are either triggers or things that the orphan... how does the orphan spirit still affect somebody who's 60?
Yeah.
61.
62.
No, you're not
60. No, that's right. I'm 61. Math is hard.
Yeah, well,
yes, I'm 61.
Yeah, 61.
Yeah, so for me, rejection.
Okay.
And just about from anybody, particularly anybody close. So if I feel any rejection from my wife, Karen, or from my children, or from my neighbor, my employer, it just triggers it. And for a long time, I didn't respond well. And that would often then lead me to be rejected in very real ways by these people who, didn't know what I was doing.
Sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then.
It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? They've rejected me, so I'm going to reject them. But I'm not going to leave, right? I'm going to make it look like I have to leave because they've done something horrible to me. And then I'd have to root up my whole family and my kids, and right? And so then there's some secondhand trauma from them because of my actions, because I couldn't get my emotions under control. And I've got a college degree, I got a master's degree, I'm a professional, I'm a pastor, and yet this heart of this abandoned child would pop up and cause my life to explode.
So remember a couple weeks ago, and I sent you that email, and you hadn't had time to read it yet. And I started to, I said, have you read that email yet? And you said no. And I said, I can't believe you. And I didn't even finish, and I was just kidding, but your whole face just fell that this is a criticism. This is something bad about me. And I had to stop you, like, no, stop. I haven't even finished my sentence yet.
Yeah.
Don't go there. Yeah. But I think it's really evident.
And see, I didn't know that, but it's an automatic response. And did you see how quickly I apologized?
Yeah, you hadn't even let me finish my sentence to tell you, or to even know if I was kidding or not, before you grabbed that, oh, I did something wrong. I'm so sorry, and didn't even even go there. Like, your immediate response was that. And I think when we talk about triggers, that it's so like unconscious, subconscious, and it's so automatic that we can't control those things. But it was just, yeah.
And see, I'm not thinking from I'm the CEO. I don't have to respond to your email. That's just not in my mind, right?
Well, that's kind of not true.
Well,
aren't you a little bit afraid of me?
No, we're all afraid of you, Claudia.
Good.
But you see what I'm saying? It's not. I don't have those kind of thoughts. I can easily be in this position of a wounded child based on some criticism. And particularly when I'm tired, and I'm tired a lot these days, so I just fall into that. And I think a lot of people will compliment me for being humble. I'm really not humble. I'm just wounded most of the time. And so I'm saying I'm sorry, or I'll do better, or where they wouldn't hear maybe somebody in leadership be like that. That's where it's coming from sometimes.
And sometimes it just is because you're humble.
Oh, well, I appreciate that.
So let's do a 3 or 4 minute kind of cliff notes of your first book, your childhood, without going into detail of some of the things that happened that shaped this spirit that you talk about.
Yeah. So my mom was 15 when she got pregnant with me, 16 when she had me, because of a horrible crime in which she was present at the time. There was a lot of drinking. She ended up in foster care, placed in an unwed mother's home, and it was while she was there that I was born. And she put me up for adoption. The pregnancy wasn't planned. She had no ability to take care of me. She grew up in a deep poverty and deprivation, just kind of the worst kind of living standards imaginable. Didn't finish high school. But the adoption didn't take place, and I ended up being placed in the same foster home she did. And when she turned 18 and aged out of foster care, she made this fateful decision that I've regretted all my life. She took me with her. And so I was a child being raised by not just a child, but a poor, dysfunctional child without any resources. And so, like a lot of women in that position, the way they survive is they hook up with some guy who's going to take care of them, protect them, provide for them, maybe be daddy to them, because she didn't really have that either. Her mother was hateful. She didn't really know her father either. So she was an orphan with a deep orphan spirit. And so I was, in and out of foster care myself, vulnerable, physically abused, neglected, sexually abused, sexually exploited. I ended up back in the same foster home when I was spent my first 2 years, and it was then that I kind of got grounded. They poured a lot of their faith into me, prayed for me every day of their life, and I believe that those prayers and some of that security I got in the first 2 years, because that's a very important time for the development of a child. So I was loved, physically hugged and held and embraced. And then I always had this memory of, George and Joanne Ball, who loved me, and I could hang on to that. And some kids don't even have that, right?
Right. So, we're going to jump to a commercial about Hope for Tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And after we finish that, I will explain why we're talking about that, and we'll go into something else. So let's watch that.
Hope for Tomorrow is a great opportunity for people to get the help that they're needing.
We're passionate about making sure that every person has a meaningful relationship that can guide them. I think I heard my voice.
Did you?
I didn't remember that I had.
Yeah. So why did we just show a commercial about counseling?
Well, you're going to read something first, and then I'm going to
then
talk
you're
about
gonna
that.
explain it? Yeah.
Yes.
So one of the things that I've been doing lately that seems to be therapeutic to me, but also maybe triggering, I don't know. But I've been doing a lot of writing, trying to find some way to express this orphan spirit. And so I find songs and kind of convert them into this. So this is, I've titled it Behind Stray Eyes. It comes from the song from The Who, Behind Blue Eyes. No one knows what it's like to be an orphan, to be an urchin behind stray eyes. No one knows what it's like to be hated, to be faded, to living only lies. But our dreams, they aren't as empty as our conscience seems to be. We have every hour only lonely. Our love is desperate, but never free. No one knows what it's like to feel these feelings like we do, and we blame you. No one bites back as hard on their anger. None of our pain and woe can show through. But our dreams, they aren't as empty as our conscience seems to be. When our fists clench, love them open before we use them and lose our cool. When we frown, tell us some good news before we yell and act like a fool. If we swallow anything evil, shove the truth down our throats. And if we shiver, please give us a blanket. Keep us warm. Let us wear your coat. No one knows what it's like to be an orphan, to be an urchin behind stray eyes.
It's pretty powerful.
Well, thank you. It's sometimes poetry can express things that just you can't say any other way.
Right. So we're going to pivot here.
Okay.
And one of the reasons we wanted to show Hope for Tomorrow, you'll figure out as we have this conversation, but you've spent a lot of the last couple of years in a place. What place would that be? Various places.
Yeah, a lot of doctors' offices. Is that what you mean? Or
Yes.
I thought you were about like a mental place. Or,
No. No, you've been to the doctor more times than probably almost anybody has in the last couple of years. So
Yeah.
I want people to hear a little bit of that story and some of the diagnoses that people thought you had and
Yeah.
where you're at with that at this point. And we'll tie it back to the first part of the...
Well, yeah, so about 3 years ago, I just started getting overwhelmed with fatigue. I just was having a hard time, and it would seem natural that I was tired from a lot of work we've done here at Patrick Henry, but it was getting worse. Nothing fixed it, no nap. I couldn't sleep enough. In fact, I was having a hard time sleeping too, so, was it that? But then I started having just lots of strange pains and aches. And so I went to the doctor, neurologist, rheumatologist, pulmonologist, endocrinologist, all the ologists. We did find some pathology in my lungs, which explains some of it, and we're having treatments with that, and that's helpful. But we really couldn't find anything. I've even had a doctor say that I'm a mystery wrapped in an enigma, or an enigma wrapped in a mystery. I couldn't remember how he said it. So I would even just, my most recent medical pilgrimage took me all the way down to Florida.
Back up a little bit because we want to talk about the part where we thought you were going to die.
Oh.
That was really scary. So let's talk about that for a second.
So most of this is happening during COVID, and everybody knows that the health community, the medical community was more stressed out probably than any community. And anybody who was seriously ill could relate to the fact that they either couldn't get medical care or it was inconsistent because they were overwhelmed and nobody could really focus on it. And so that was part of it. And so I had a neurologist who thought, well, maybe you have ALS. Mm. And as soon as you hear that, I mean, that's like hearing you may have cancer, right? Your world goes bonkers. And took my wife and kids, through a dark time. And the reason for that is because I'm, physically losing strength. It's not just energy. I'm losing strength, and particularly in my legs. If I walk for very long, so turns out that's not it. So did I catch up? Now, did I catch up to where I need to be?
Now you're going to Mayo now.
Okay, so now I'm going down to Mayo, one of the premier medical facilities in the country, right? And go to an endocrinologist, which is very hard to get into, even when it's not a pandemic. Number of tests, and one of those was to test the adrenal glands. And they wanted to look at cortisol levels, and there's another hormone, I can't remember, but it all has to do with adrenaline, which gives us energy, particularly in the fight and flight kind of situation. And the average range of whatever this unit of measure is, cortisol, it was from normal is from 0 to 24. And I got 4. So I thought that was pretty low, and I thought, I finally got an answer. My body's not producing enough cortisol and this other hormone. And she said, no, it's in normal range. And I said, well, what if I'd gotten a 1? She said, well, it's not 0. I said, but even the average range is 0, right? If I got a 0, you still wouldn't say anything. And she basically admitted that the medical community knows what to do with high cortisol. If it was over 24, they have a treatment for that, but have no clinical evidence of what to do or how to describe if your body's not producing enough cortisol or adrenaline. And so there's a lot of folks out there, some in the medical community, but mostly in kind of alternative medicines who do believe in adrenaline fatigue, that the body gets exhausted from producing this adrenaline. And so there's adrenaline supplements, and I'm taking that now, and it does seem to have helped. But in my mind, it goes back to what we know about trauma, or what we now know about trauma, and that the body produces adrenaline in the fight and flight. So when you're being physically abused or neglected or sexually abused, right, that's...
Or even just scared.
Or just scared, right?
Yeah.
Produces adrenaline. And but my survival mechanism was never fight, and it was rarely even flight. It was freeze. I just stood there and took it.
But inwardly, your cortisol is just
But
off
inward,
the charts,
yeah, right. It's just off the charts. And so in my mind, and I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a researcher, not a scientist, but in my mind, I'm thinking at this age and stage in my life, my body just saying, we're done, right? So we're just done. And then you add any kind of additional life stresses or anything on that, and it adds to that. So I think that's where we're at.
So why do you think that more people aren't talking about this, or why is this not a medical issue?
Well, which is interesting. So I went into an email conversation back and forth with the Mayo endocrinologist, and I talked about ACEs. I said, I have an ACE score of 9, assuming she knew what that was. And would that have any impact on low, cortisol? And she came back and says, well, I just did a brief overview of ACEs
At Mayo.
Which I was surprised. And she said, I'm happy to refer you to a psychiatrist. And I just felt wounded by that. Right? I believe in counseling. We put a lot of resources here in counseling because I believe, that is one of the answers. And I wish when I was younger we knew about trauma, right? But I was kind of disappointed in that. I think there is physical thing. But you made a point about being a 9 and maybe how unusual it is that I'm even sitting here talking to you right now.
Well, not about being a 9.
A score of 9.
Oh, yes. So my theory, when I heard you say that Mayo hadn't had any research on all this, is that if you take a kid with as much trauma as you experienced, right? And so I think it's not just what you experience as a child, because cortisol comes when your amygdala gets hijacked and you're reliving something in your childhood, maybe not even something you remember, but the cortisol still is getting done. So you have 18 years of childhood trauma, and then you have another 40 years of reliving that trauma, and so the cortisol's coming. But most people who are 60, who have a childhood like yours, who have never had the resources to work through that, are addicts, right? They're dead, they're incarcerated, or they're living in poverty and they wouldn't go to Mayo, right?
Right.
And so I think the group of people out there who could even identify with this is pretty small. And so that may be one of the reasons why there's not a lot of research out there. But my guess is there are people out there, they're just not people who are seeking that kind of medical treatment.
Or even as the endocrinologist said, this is a social work problem. This is a psychiatry problem. This is a counseling problem. It's not a medical problem. When in fact the whole idea of what we've learned from the ACEs was medical research, right? So it's just got to get out there further.
Yeah, and I think that the more we start thinking about this and talking about it, the better off we can be. So,
but can I just say this? What you just said. So I'm the oldest. Right. I have 13 siblings between the children that my mother had and the children my father had, and they all grew up with also very high ACE scores.
But no full siblings. You don't have any full siblings, right? Okay.
Right. So they're all half siblings, right? But they also grew up in poverty, same kind of thing. And half of them are already dead. I'm the oldest, and half of them are already dead, right?
Wow. Yeah.
2 suicides. 2 have died from AIDS. One was just died literally homeless. Many of them have been in drug rehab facilities. I think all but a couple of them have been in prison for violence, and they multiple unsupported children, multiple relationships. Their lives are mostly a mess, and just living day to day. So your theory about it, right? Getting to this point has been a challenge more than even I thought, right? So just doing the education, getting married, having the kids, and just to say, you know what, my children are not going to do this.
Right.
And that alone takes a lot of energy. I didn't realize how much my children trigger parents all the time, but I think I had a different kind of triggering.
Okay.
And even in my relationship with my wife, Karen, and she's been a saint all these years, right? The fact that I'm going to love you. I'm not going to leave you. I don't know how many times she has said that to me in our 40 years. I'm not going to leave you, so just settle down. I'm coming from that perspective.
Right.
I'm not the one going to leave. She's the one that's going to leave.
Right. Just a matter of when.
It's just a matter of when. And it's not a good way to live or have a relationship.
So, my story, our kids all have ACEs. We've adopted kids, and our youngest is almost 24. And when you got back from Mayo was about the time that he was coming back home from being away for a while. And I was mentioning to him that there are answers now, that we know a lot more about the brain. We know a lot about trauma. We know how to help people process that so that they can heal. And he said, I can't talk about my childhood or think about it because it just messes me up. And I told him, there's a way to get to the point that you can talk about it and it doesn't mess you up. But if you don't, you're going to end up like my boss, right? You're going to be triggered all the time. And he's definitely a freeze. He's not a fight or flight either. He's just a freeze. Disassociate, walk away,
Hide in your room, yeah.
And so he's going to end up being in the same place if he's continuing to relive that trauma subconsciously, get triggered, cortisol all the time. And so that's why we played the Hope for Tomorrow commercials. So tell people a little bit about what we've learned about childhood trauma and how it can be kind of healed or transformed a little.
Yeah. And this has all been happening in the last 12 years that I've been here, that I've learned about it and we've learned about it as an organization. Just from the research, and then as we've learned about it and we've gone to training, and some of our staff are, very well acquainted with this. So we've been implementing that in the care of kids first to the kids in group homes and now in other settings. And it goes back to the basic question. Instead of saying, what is wrong with this kid? You say, what has happened to this kid? And it's, from a biblical perspective, it's filled with much more grace and understanding that things happen to people, right? Right. Sometimes we as Christians look at somebody and say, wow, look at that sin. Now, that sinful behavior often is a reflection or a consequence or a result of sinful things that has happened to them, right? So people are not just perpetrators, they're victims as well. And grace allows us to look back behind the curtain and say, how did you get hurt in such a way that now you're hurting others? And so that's caused us to give a lot of resources into expanding Hope for Tomorrow, not just in terms of locations, but in the types of therapy and counseling that we provide. We know in-home is important. If we can reach kids at school, where a lot of triggering is probably happening, and it's hard for them to settle down and learn, it's important to get education there.
And back when we were raising our kids, 25 years ago, we didn't even know how much trauma impacted the brain. A childhood trauma brain is changed, and it has to be healed, and we now have the tools to do that. So we're going to move into the Vision 30 video, which is how we always end. But
and I want to say something, because the very first question you asked was, I don't think I ever answered, and I think it's important. So I'm not calling myself Chief Executive Officer as much these days as I'm calling myself the Chief Executive Orphan, right? I'm getting to a point where I'm saying, taking that perspective from Paul, right, that this pain that's not going to go away and the trouble that I've had is ultimately for others' good. And so I'm learning to embrace the identity that I am a recovering orphan, that I am an orphan. And maybe that's really the bigger part of the picture. Right? I think I could provide more help, both individually, but also from a community perspective, to remind people of what happens to orphans. Right? Almost anybody can be a CEO. Only I can be an orphan. Right? Only an orphan can be an orphan. But not very many orphans can get to a point where they can express it, right? I grew up without anybody reading to me, writing. You know how math is tough to me. Well, English was hard too. The only reason I knew what a noun was is because of school, school rock, right? And so even those skills of learning to write and to communicate, I've had to learn later on in life. I didn't survive by my wits. I survived by my charm. No, seriously, it was a survival mode. If I could get you to like me, you probably won't hurt me, and you'll take care of me. Mm. And that's not really necessarily a healthy place to be, but that's how I survived. And I don't know why I got into that, but that's why I call myself the Chief Executive Orphan.
Okay. And I think there's so much more we could talk about.
Yes,
we're out of town.
We could.
But in the Vision 30 video, we talk about how we see ourselves as having a different role with Vision 30. But we also have Hope for Tomorrow as being our upstream. We want to see people become cycle breakers. You're a cycle breaker. Mm. Your kids did not grow up like you grew up.
Exactly.
And so we want to help people heal from their childhood
Amen.
trauma so that they can become cycle breakers. So let's roll
the film.
Nobody gets to choose their family. If a person is fortunate enough to be born into a healthy family, then life can be much like floating down a smooth, gentle river in the summertime. But an unhealthy family is like a dangerous river, filled with rocks, debris, and fast-moving water. This river swiftly leads to the steep waterfall of adulthood, tragically forming a new river of dysfunction. Even if you aren't born into an unhealthy river, there are many streams that cause a person to get there. But there is only one way to get out, and that is through a meaningful relationship. Across our region, there are many agencies, churches, and families who are devoted to helping children escape from unhealthy rivers. Some feel their role is to wade in and rescue children. They foster, adopt, or provide safe families. Others stand by the river and support the rescuers by providing what they need. Still, others are upstream and stand in the gap to keep children from ending up in the negative situations. At Patrick Henry Family Services, we see ourselves as having an additional role. We are running up and down the shores of the unhealthy river, screaming, "Can't you see the children in the water? You have to do something." Vision 30 is a 10-year initiative. By 2030, we envision a region where all children are safe in their own family, or with caregivers who are supported by a local faith community. So, where do you stand at the river? Are you upstream, keeping families together and strong by standing in the gap? Are you in the river, directly impacting children? Are you on the shore, providing support for the brave folks who have entered the river? Or are you just passing by without noticing? No matter who you are, come down to the river with us. Let us help you find your place. Not only will lives be changed, but you will never be the same.